But we begin today with James Dyson. Do you want to know how nuts I am? Do you want a little insight into how my brain works? Okay, so here are 3 thoughts that I could use to lead you into the James Dyson story, the continuing James Dyson story. The first is, why do Boris Johnson's text messages from not just James Dyson, but we learned today sundry other favoured business people, donors and plutocrats, why is it just like the way that black cab drivers got shafted by Uber? Bet that got your attention, didn't it? Get your eyes back on the road. Why is this an example at prime ministerial level of exactly the same unfairness and injustice suffered by the black cab drivers of this country? That would be question number 1 as a way into the James Dyson story. Question number 2, have you ever wondered how these islands came to be owned by a tiny, tiny number of people/families post 1066? That's how far back you have to go. If you're new to the programme, I'm not one of those people in the British media who thinks you shouldn't learn more about your own country's history. I'm one of those people who thinks that knowledge is power, and power is good. But if you've ever wondered how a tiny number of families ended up owning almost all of these islands, while the likes of you and me and our ancestors and forebears couldn't even really dream of property ownership until, halfway through the last century, probably, then the James Dyson story and the response to it from some corners of the public will help you understand how we've ended up living in a country that is still largely owned by a tiny, tiny number of families, while for the first time in living memory, younger people are finding it harder than ever and harder than their parents to get onto the property ladder. And then the third way into it would simply be to explain why sleaze and this sort of growing stench hasn't landed yet. And it's linked to point 2. It's because there is a sense, and we saw it a lot during Brexit, there is a sense of people believe, well, they're better than us. They're allowed to do whatever they want. They're very, very rich. They shouldn't have to pay taxes. I saw a tweet yesterday claiming that wealth creators shouldn't pay taxes. Some fella got in touch to say, well, remind me how many jobs nurses create. And you look at stuff like that, and it was normal, it was a real person. You look at stuff like that and you think, my goodness me, we've got a long way to go, haven't we, before we even begin to inhabit a universe that recognises simple decency. How many jobs do nurses create? Why shouldn't they pay a greater proportion of their income in tax than a billionaire entrepreneur who's shifted his production to Singapore does? But hey-ho. And then, of course, the fourth way into the story is the way I'm going to... I should probably explain, should I know, the reasoning behind those 3 positions before I crack on with the topic in hand and invite you to ring in? So, or shall I do that later? Do it as a hook into... I'll do that a little bit later, but you need to remind me, because you know what my memory's like these days. The word sieve springs to mind. It's leakier than Downing Street at the moment, my brain. So remind me later in the programme, Keith, I'm talking to you, to explain why Boris Johnson's text messages are the political equivalent of cab drivers getting shafted by Uber. Why the James Dyson story helps us understand how we've ended up in a country owned by a tiny number of families, while the likes of you and me couldn't dream of owning property until halfway through the last century, and why the sleaze isn't landing. That's linked. Because the way into it that I want to go is this. We didn't talk about it yesterday because there were so many people correctly and rightly queuing up to talk about George Floyd. And although I don't know if you've seen the story about the Olympics, I did wonder yesterday how long it would take before some invitations were issued to start attacking or poo-pooing the notion of taking the knee in support of Black Lives Matter. I didn't think it would be 24 hours, but there we are. So the protests that followed the racist murder of George Floyd prompted some people on the far right. Some of the stuff going on Fox News at the moment is absolutely disgusting. I played you that clip yesterday of one of their presenters having an absolute meltdown at the suggestion that Derek Chauvin behaved inappropriately. The white supremacism is, well, I mean, pretty much they're saying it out loud now. But I did wonder how long it would take before the taking of the knee began with Colin Kaepernick, of course, and then accelerated and grew enormously in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder. I wondered how long it would take before people started trying to poo-poo it again or attack it. It took 24 hours due to a nuanced story involving the Olympics, which we may touch on, but only for a moment or two, because it is our lives, your life, my life, that I want to focus on first. And that is why the Dyson story left me yesterday as I came off air with that tip of your tongue feeling. Do you ever have that? Of course you do. We all do. What is it? What is it? I can't, there's something I can't remember. There's something about this story that's really important, and I can't remember what it is. And it's my job to remember what it is. Your job's just to sit there and listen. Pay attention at the back. My job is to remember the important stuff, and I couldn't remember what it was. So it was fairly clear that, you know, if we live in a country where people have been successfully persuaded that, quotes, wealth creators, end quotes, shouldn't pay taxes and nurses should, it was fairly clear that this wasn't going to land yet in the way that Labour want it to. Starmer did a half-decent job at PMQs yesterday, but I'm afraid he missed at least 3 open goals. Some newspapers reporting, including the Mail, which is always significant, some newspapers suggesting that there is now a slight John Major-esque air to this administration, but I'm not so sure. I'd point you towards Johnny Mercer, who was a minister in this government until this week, and then came out yesterday and explained how they're all actually liars. And you sort of go, yeah, well done, mate. You took a senior role in the Leopards Eating People's Faces party, and now you're surprised that they've eaten your face. You may have a little touch on that in a moment as well, in the course of today's show. Mystery Hour, of course, at 12. But I remembered what it was. Nobody, because we covered this at the time, I don't know if you remember, nobody thought that Dyson or JCB were in with a prayer of coming up with viable ventilators. The confusion in the industry, the confusion in the sector, the confusion among medical professionals and experts in the field of ventilators were absolutely baffled at the time as to why these companies with no track record in the field, which is not the be-all and end-all of the issue. No track record in the field is not a prerequisite for being able to repurpose production lines and turn them into something that could produce ventilators. But you'd need some knowledge and expertise. And none of the people who had it could understand at the time why Dyson and JCB were getting this sort of promotion and even, well, we now know, preferential treatment. It was a mystery. It was a mystery that we covered at the time. The story that I think prompted us to look at it is from April of last year. Do you know, almost to the day. What's the date today? The 22nd. It was April the 17th last year. And I can't remember whether it was on that particular day that Peter Foster of the Financial Times came onto this programme to talk us through his article. But the article appeared under the headline, Muddled Thinking Punctures Plan. So great alliteration, that. Muddled Thinking Punctures Plan. Have to be careful with the plosives when you're using a microphone in a studio such as this, even without coronavirus and the attendant issue of waterborne particles. The plosives play havoc with our levels. I don't know what that means, but people like Keith talk about levels all the time. The plosives. A muddled thinking punctures plan for British ventilator is part of the story. The other part of the story is out there today already, with one senior academic in the field saying we never really understood why Dyson and JCB were getting so much preferential treatment. Here it is. Andrew Farmery, who's a professor of anaesthetics at Oxford University. He was at the forefront of what was called the OxVent project. And he has explained or criticised the way that Sir James Dyson was given attention by the government despite having no clinical expertise. It's an astonishing story. He says the Dyson prototype was, quotes, never a goer, end quotes. And he says, and remember, he's only a professor of anaesthetics at Oxford University, so, you know, he's not very good at hand dryers or vacuum cleaners. But he says he believes that both Sir James Dyson and the Prime Minister both knew it wasn't going to actually happen. And, of course, it didn't happen. And it was predicted at the time that it would never happen. His theory is that the government wanted the ventilator shortage to be solved by UK PLC rather than, in his words, anonymous university nerds. This, of course, means that the government wasted time and money issuing this general appeal to anyone who could design a ventilator rather than using experts. And who was it that was deriding experts back in 2016? I forget. Who was it that said something about the country has had enough of experts? I'm sure he didn't end up in a senior role in the government that ignored experts when the potential ventilator crisis appeared on the horizon. I think his name was Michael Gove, but he's dropped right off the radar, hasn't he? He's got no power or position of importance these days. So rather than getting experts to brainstorm the problem, they wasted time and money on a sort of PR exercise. The Oxvent flat pack ventilator, created by a joint team at Oxford and King's College London, just as that first wave was engulfing hospitals. It passed all the checks, all the regulatory checks, but luckily the demand for ventilators subsided in May after that first wave peaked in April. Here's the quote that is actually the crux of these inappropriate texts being exchanged by Boris Johnson and James Dyson. Many entrants to the challenge had no background in ventilator use and design and no understanding of the clinical problem. The Dyson proposal typified this. So, two cohorts of callers today. If you have any understanding of ventilator production and the relevant engineering issues, then that makes one of us, because I don't. But I'd love to hear from you. 0345 6060973 to answer the technicals of the question. And then the rest of us who can just look at this question from the outside. Why would Boris Johnson be so keen to not only get involved, but also offer preferential crony-ish treatment to companies that had, in the words of this genuine expert, no background in ventilator use and design? And I'll take any answer you have on that. Why do you think Boris Johnson, in March and April of last year, decided to treat people like James Dyson and the bloke what runs JCB as if they were potential saviours, potential ventilator champions, while effectively ignoring academics and engineers who really knew the field and really knew what they were talking about? Okay? That's your starter at 10. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. If you know about this field, if you understand this field, front of the queue. If, like me, you don't, but you do quite like to speculate about political motivations, why would Boris Johnson ignore people who knew what they were talking about while offering, let's just say, preferential treatment to people who didn't, and specifically James Dyson and the bloke what runs JCB? 2 out of the UK's 3 main ventilator makers told the Financial Times in March of last year, in April of last year, that their contact with government officials only began in mid-March, around the same time that Johnson was rolling up companies like Dyson, JCB, Rolls-Royce, Airbus and Honda to sort of invent their own ventilators. Stephen Phipson, who was the chief executive of the manufacturers group, still is, I think, Make UK, said at the time that British companies would be better placed to make proven models that already existed under licence. So why do you think Boris Johnson was so desperate enough to actually change the tax rules for James Dyson to get involved? And although this didn't involve changes in tax rules, the bloke what runs JCB. Alicia is in Bath. Alicia, what can you tell us?
Hi. Yeah, I'm as baffled as you are.
Oh.
I work for a ventilation company in the UK, and we had plenty of ventilators lined up ready to go and be used for the NHS. Right. And we had a couple of conversations with the Department of Health, and they weren't interested at all, even though the ventilator challenge was going on. And, ours were approved and ready to be used. And no, they weren't interested at all.
I mean, but this is almost unbelievable. I've got no reason to doubt you. I mean, obviously, I take your credentials at face value and in good faith. But you're saying that you had essentially a production line in place, and they didn't.
We had them in the UK, yeah.
And they barely returned your calls. So you had them here, and they barely returned your calls, while Boris Johnson was doing favours for James Dyson, who most people, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, most people close to the issue, close to the engineering challenges, didn't think he had a prayer of ever coming up with anything viable anyway.
Absolutely. It is absolutely mind-blowing. And they did eventually get back to us, I think maybe 4 weeks or 6 weeks later.
Yes.
Said, yeah, OK, then we'll have them. And obviously, they'd already gone. So we'd already shipped them to Scotland and Ireland.
Good grief. Came back to you after JCB and Dyson had failed to come up with anything, presumably, or I don't know what the timing was.
That if he wanted to keep it in the country, so to speak, you know, they wanted, if that was his sort of ideology, sorry, then I get it. But why, now that we've had this paper published about all the ventilators, where they came from, who made them, and where they went, and how many were bought, which is an official published paper,
yes.
Why have we bought so many Chinese ventilators at £50,000 a go? Bearing in mind, the average ventilator costs between 10 and 15,000
right.
to buy. We have bought hundreds of these Chinese ventilators at £50,000 a go, and they were the only ones that wanted cash up front. Everybody else was happy to, be paid at a later date post-pandemic. I just find it all very bizarre and very...
Could it possibly be linked in some way, if not specifically, then tangentially, to the story today published by the anti-corruption campaigners Transparency International, who say that more than £2 billion of PPE and testing contracts were awarded by the government to companies with links to prominent Tories? I wonder, Alicia. I mean...
Yeah, who knows?
Who knows?
The cynic in me wants to jump up and down and say it's blindingly obvious, but...
We'd have to find out who the middlemen were on these deals with Chinese manufacturers and where the commissions were going. And, of course,
and why were they so ready to go, with these ventilators? And why did they want upfront payments? And why did we pay $50,000 when, the average ventilator in the country that the NHS buys, pre-pandemic is between 10 and 15,000? That's a massive, huge jump.
It is. Even my rudimentary arithmetic can recognise the size of that. The size of that gap.
It's mind blowing. It really is. And not only that, they're useless. They're absolutely useless. I regularly go into clinical engineering departments in the NHS.
Yes.
I'm going to one today,
okay.
And they're all lined up with stickers saying "out of use," "do not use." They haven't even lasted 6 months.
Well, to be honest, I thought I'd already opened a can of worms this morning with the sort of retrospective remembering of what we covered last April with regard to the debacle surrounding ventilator production. But you've just opened a barrel of worms with this observation. So you're saying that we wasted money on overpriced ventilators that weren't fit for purpose, while at the time the Prime Minister was busy taking a few moments off from playing Candy Crush on his phone to swap cosy texts with Sir James Dyson.
It sounds about right.
Do you listen to this programme on a regular basis?
I do, yes.
Do you know what a Ray Liotta is?
Radiator,
no,
yes, I do.
Are you sure? You don't have to pretend, just to humour me.
I heard you do it. You wanted to revoke someone's recently. I was listening.
I did want to revoke someone. So a Ray Liotta is an award that we reserve for people who are unbelievably qualified to comment on whatever matter is in hand. And I'll let you decide. But my instincts tell me that you probably fit into that category this morning. Given that you're about to go into one of the relevant NHS departments and marvel at the crud they purchased, instead of returning your calls back in March of last year. So, Alicia, quite unexpectedly, given the context of this conversation, this is for you.
I'm Ray Liotta, and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. If you build it, they will come.
Unless, of course, you're building ventilators, in which case it would appear that the current government will not turn up at any point, or indeed, if they do, it'll be too late, because you've already, as Alicia told us, shipped them to Scotland and Ireland. So why do you think Boris Johnson was so keen to cosy up with James Dyson and offer up preferential tax arrangements that plebs like doctors, nurses, carers and you would never get in a million years? In the same way, you'd never be able to drop him a cosy little text asking for favours. What was it about Dyson, maybe JCB, that made Boris Johnson... I was about to say turn off his moral compass, but I don't think anybody would take that suggestion seriously. The idea that Boris Johnson has a moral compass, just ask any of his ex-wives, bosses or party leaders or mistresses. But what was it about JCB and Dyson that made him ignore the experts, ignore the academics, ignore people like Alicia, ignore people like the Oxvac programme who were actually producing stuff, and ignore the expert advice to focus on producing stuff that had already been designed under licence, instead of phoning up a bloke that builds diggers and a bloke famous for making vacuum cleaners and begging them to come up with some slap-bang wallop brand new wizard wheeze? I can almost feel what the answer might be to that, but I'm just not quite getting there. And remember, I also have to solve the mysteries of why this story reminds me of both Uber and the Norman conquest. It's coming up to 10:30. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Should we go to the news a bit early? First time ever, is it? Almost. Deborah Meaden, the dragon of TV law, has just tweeted, if you try to go through the correct processes, you are ignored. I had many people contact me about supplying PPE and ventilators who were unable even to get acknowledged. So it would appear that Alicia, our last caller, although richly deserving of her Ray Liotta, was far from alone. Margaret Hodge, former chair of the Public's Account Committee, told Newsnight last night, what we're getting to is an era where now it seems if you have the phone number of Rishi Sunak, Matt Hancock or indeed Boris Johnson, you can do business by text message, which leads me to this rather nice text from Annette, which says, James, why on earth is none of this sticking? I've just listened to a phone-in on the BBC. What? Annette. Obviously, they don't go into as much depth as you do. Well, obviously, Annette. And most of the callers saw nothing wrong in contacting friends in industry and giving favours out to them. They were saying it happens all the time in business, and they won't understand that this is public money and rules exist to protect public money. Where on earth do we go? Are we too far down the rabbit hole? And I'll tell you now, Annette, the first of the mysteries that I set up at the top of this hour, why this story helps us understand how we've ended up living in a country where a tiny number of families own almost all of the land, while the likes of you and me, I presume, of course, unless you can trace your lineage back to friends of William the Conqueror, the likes of you and me couldn't even dream of owning property until roughly the middle of the last century. And the answer is that people think that the what were aristocrats and are now entrepreneurs, they deserve it. They deserve it. That's the simple answer. People think that, oh no, that's absolutely fine. They're better humans than we are. They deserve more than we are. They shouldn't have to pay taxes. They're wealth creators. Nurses pay taxes, obviously. They just save lives, look after people, bring life into the world. But wealth creators who exist almost exclusively to enrich themselves, they're the best people. So whether it's an earl or a duke, or whether it's a billionaire or an entrepreneur, it's exactly the same principle. And the plebs, and I use that word affectionately because I am one, and as regular listeners will know, I'm fond of a few people more than I'm fond of myself. So we plebs, we love it. We like having. They used to call them great men in Tudor times. You know, these gangsters, effectively. And then you think to Elizabeth I and her state-sanctioned pirates who'd sail around the world. And we get taught in school that people like Walter Raleigh were massive heroes. Francis Drake, pre-Armada, which was obviously a great national service that he did, fending off the Spaniards. But the privateers were pirates. That's why they don't want to teach history. So there's your answer. That's why it reminds me of the Norman invasion, the Norman conquest. There is literally baked into our bloodstreams in this country an idea that they're better than us. The rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate. God made them high and lowly, each one to his estate. We used to sing that at school, Annette, and that is how they get away with it. The rich man in his castle, James Dyson, the poor man at his gate. Nurses. That's it. So when people ring phone-in shows to say this is absolutely fine, I've got no problem with this whatsoever, it's absolutely marvellous, he was only trying to protect his employees. He is believed to have arrived in Britain the day after he got the text message. Believed, understood, reported by the BBC, to have arrived in the UK the day after he got the text message from Johnson saying, don't worry, old boy, we'll sort this out. So now all I have to do is remember to explain to you why it also reminds me of cab drivers getting shafted by Uber. If you can work that one out, blank faces in the studio. If you can work that one out, I'll give you the money myself. Tim is in Leeds. Tim, what can you tell us?
Hi, James.
Hello, mate.
So I operate ventilators for a living.
Yeah. I bet you've never made a Hoover.
Well, no. Well, exactly. And I think that what I completely do not understand is ventilators are incredibly complex things, way even beyond my limits of understanding. And I work with them all the time because the physics into them is so intricate.
Sure.
And I do not understand how somebody with no experience can suddenly say, oh, yes, we're going to do this, because it takes 2 to 3 years to develop a ventilator. And that you can find that out from simply a quick
Which is why
will tell you.
It's an emergency, potentially. Thankfully, it didn't go nearly as badly as it could have done. As far as I can tell, the expert opinion was saying, make the ones that have already been invented. Make them under license, make them as quickly as you can, buy them, move them. Alicia has already told us that she couldn't get rid of hers for love nor money. They all ended up being sold to Ireland and Scotland after the Department of Health failed to return her calls until it was too late. And yet Boris Johnson somehow thought that the digger man and the vacuum man would be able to invent a brand new one and pluck it out of the ether in a matter of weeks. Come on, you've got to have a theory. You're a very clever man. You work in intensive care.
Well, yeah, exactly. And I think that's where my problem with it comes, is it makes absolutely no sense. We were having loads of ventilators being delivered. They were there. I'm sure there were some areas of the country that might have been short, but we managed. And frankly, if a ventilator came along that had been developed in a matter of weeks and had Dyson stamped on it, I would feel very nervous for that entire shift using that ventilator. I wouldn't trust it as far as I can throw it.
Simply because, I mean, you're not casting aspersions on him or his products. You're just saying it wouldn't have had a proven track record. It would have been box fresh. And the last thing you want in intensive care is untested, unproven, brand new box fresh kit.
Yeah, exactly.
Even I understand that. Tim, thank you. The mystery there from the intensive care ward. The mystery before that from somebody who works in ventilator supply. Are you with me yet? Do you get it yet? Or are you still tugging the old forelock and saying, well, I don't think Dyson should pay taxes at all? How quickly have we gone? You remember I said to you, if this story was about anything except football, they'd be queuing up to tell you why the big business people should be able to do whatever the hell they like. I said that to you on Monday and Tuesday of this week, right? It's now Thursday, and they're queuing up to tell you that big business people should be able to do whatever the hell they like. Oh, I hadn't even spotted that. We need a kind of ding sound effect, don't we, for the little light bulb going off above my head. Speaking of sound effects, can you get the Hallelujah ready? Because I've got a feeling that we might need it in the course of the next few minutes. That's just it, though. Do you remember? I said to you on Monday and Tuesday, of course you remember, I said it until I was blue in the face. I bombarded your ears with the observation that they would absolutely be defending the football club owners if they were in any other field of commerce. Of course the richest people should. These are big business people. They should. We can't expect them to obey the rules that the little people have to obey. Free market, free enterprise. You're stifling innovation. You're standing in the way of wealth creation. Anything except football. Fast forward to Thursday, the European Super League is toast. And people are queuing up to say that business people like James Dyson shouldn't have to obey the same rules that the rest of us do. There's absolutely nothing wrong with special contacts with the Prime Minister, and he's a great force for good. So why was Boris Johnson so keen to ignore experts, ignore people with experience in the field, ignore people with track records, ignore people with ventilators, and focus instead on the Dyson fella and the JCB bloke? 0345 6060 973. Patrick is in Orpington. Patrick, what would you like to say?
Hi, good morning,
Hello,
James.
yes.
I think the reason was Brexit.
I think you might have got it. By Jove, Patrick, I think you might have got it.
Am I right in thinking that both Dyson and JCB, two of the very, very few companies that were, in favour of vote leave, are the two that you're mentioning this morning?
I think you may. All that we needed for the holy trinity of head cases would be the bloke from Wetherspoons claiming he could knock up a ventilator out of redundant beer pumps.
Then you'd have the hat-trick.
And then you'd have the hat-trick.
It's just another example of, if you've got Boris Johnson's telephone number, you'll get free money or free advertising for your company.
And it would have been, I mean, it's PR. I mean, this idea that neither of them thought, and this isn't my idea, this is someone who may or may not know what he's talking about, but he is an academic working in the field. He led the development of a ventilator to tackle the first wave of coronavirus last year, and he has said he doesn't think that either of them thought that it was ever actually going to happen. So it was all about, it's essentially just flaggy, isn't it? They just thought that they could wave a flag at it and somehow get a result.
Yeah. Yep.
I'm glad you've come on a little later in the programme, because if I'd had to pull out the Hallelujah earlier, it might have rather shot our fox. And isn't it amazing that you come on after an intensive care professional and a ventilator supply professional both expressing utter bafflement at why this happened? And the answer, do you want to say it again and see if the Hallelujah is still working, Patrick?
It was all about Brexit.
That's amazing. Paul's in Chertsey. Paul, what do you reckon?
Hi, James.
Hello.
I had to phone in after this one. So, for a living, I fix ventilators.
Yeah, but I bet you've never made a digger.
I I wish I could. I'd probably make more money. But I never forget, especially in the first wave, at the first wave when Boris Johnson gave the announcement that he said he was going to get all these companies making ventilators just like that.
Yep.
I could not believe what I was hearing on the telly. I really couldn't. The technology that's involved in ventilator manufacturing and anesthesia manufacturing is just phenomenal. It's incredibly complex. You're not putting these patients weren't going on ventilators for a few hours. They were on them for weeks. The vast majority of intensive care units and operating theatres where they had COVID patients, they were on them for a very long time, weeks, months in some cases.
Sure.
And you cannot put someone on an old or a new mechanical ventilator just chugging up and down and expect them to breathe normally. I mean, there'll be clinical specialists listening to this and they can give you far more info on that than I, but even in my rudimentary understanding of it, is I know you cannot do that. And as for what the lady was saying previously about the Chinese ventilators just sitting in medical engineering departments, they're there still, and they're just sitting there doing nothing. And the government flooded the NHS with all these products, basically things that they just didn't need or didn't want, and the items that they did need, they couldn't supply. I mean, in the first wave, I was running around like a headless chicken, having to convert anesthesia machine ventilators from oxygen to run on air because there was a massive panic about there not being enough oxygen to supply people on ventilators. But that didn't get sort of dragged out in the wash, did it? No one seems to have heard about that, but you're hearing about it in India at the moment.
Oh, of course.
And there was a huge concern about that. But yeah, like I say, no one heard about that in incredibly scary times. And I'm walking into operating theatres, they couldn't even supply us with PPE. I mean, it's ridiculous. I know one hospital, and it's not actually that far from where you live, where the staff were having to wear patient pajamas at the weekend because there was no scrubs, there was no PPE.
We took calls at the time, I think, from the hospital you referred to, as well as many others. Paul, please don't think I'm patronising you, but why didn't you just text Boris Johnson about this?
Would I get a response? No, I don't know, James. It's just like bashing your head against the wall.
Isn't it? Well, look what you've done now. You've given me you're the sort of Holy Ghost in this trinity, because we took a call from someone who sells ventilators. We've taken a call from somebody who works with ventilators in intensive care, and we've taken a call from somebody who fixes and adapts ventilators for medical need. And every single one of you has said exactly the same thing, which is that you have no clue whatsoever what the hell they were playing at, asking people like Dyson and the JCB bloke to invent or to produce ventilators from scratch. I mean, that is actually incredible. In my wildest dreams, and obviously I don't want to be reporting on this appalling conduct and this unbelievable cronyism, but in my wildest dreams I couldn't have got. I mean, what's missing? I don't think anything is missing, is it? We've got someone who sells them, someone who uses them, and someone who fixes them, all singing from the same hymn sheet, Paul.
Yeah, it's incredibly frightening, and I think if the general public knew exactly what we're not on, they'd be horrified. I
don't know that they. I mean, as you know, and as we discussed just before the last caller, actually, would the general public be horrified, or would they go along with it in the same way that they have gone along with this idea for hundreds of years? No, it's not for the likes of earls and entrepreneurs to be treated like the rest of us. The rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate. God made them high and lowly. Wow. Listen, I'm late for the break as usual, so I'll go to it now, and I shall reel alone and silently. But listen, even if you hate my guts and you only tune in because you've got some sort of weird form of audio masochism, and you still think Boris Johnson is a stand-up guy, even as one of his former ministers describes his government as the most distrustful, awful environment I've ever worked in. It is a bit of a cesspit. Almost nobody tells the truth. Flipping lefty snowflake Johnny Mercer, Conservative MP and former Conservative minister. You've got to come on one day. Even a stop clock is right twice a day, right? That's 3 people. One who sells ventilators, one who works with ventilators in intensive care units, one who fixes ventilators. All 3 of them telling you this stinks. But hey-ho, doff cap, tug forelock, vote Johnson. Lest you think I was exaggerating, it's not me that's described this government as a cesspit. Well, I probably have, but not today. It's not me who has described it as one of the most distrustful, awful environments I've ever worked in, because I've never worked in it. It's not me who has claimed that almost nobody in it tells the truth. It is Johnny Mercer, who until this week was a minister in this government. So on the one hand, well, there are 3 points here, 3 potential problems. The first is that the people who took senior posts in the Leopards Eating People's Faces party do look a little bit ridiculous when they turn around and say, I didn't realise they were going to eat my face, which is very much the position that Johnny Mercer finds himself in. The cause célèbre upon which he has been sacked or threatened to resign is a lot trickier than perhaps many people understand. The idea that veterans of the Northern Ireland Troubles, British military veterans of the Northern Ireland Troubles, should be excused from prosecution for torturing and murdering civilians is, I mean, not quite as simple an issue as some of the coverage would allow. It would also, I think, have blown the Good Friday Agreement to smithereens, although there's still a very good chance of Brexit doing that. And, of course, the third element of the story is that this is from within, as an evolution of the Leopards Eating People Faces point. This is someone inside, someone who was part of Johnson's leadership campaign, certainly a prominent supporter of it. And here he is turning around less than 2 years after that election victory, describing it as a distrustful, awful environment, a bit of a cesspit, almost nobody tells the truth. 7 times at the dispatch box, he says, I promised to bring forward legislation to prevent what he calls injustices in this area, and every time it did not happen. I didn't deliver on what I said I would, but you supported Boris Johnson, Johnny. A fish rots from the head down, mate. You support a government built entirely on lies. You can't really expect Keith to get his violin out when you find out you've been lied to. That's how I would see it anyway. So, astonishingly today, we've taken a call from a woman who sells ventilators. We've taken a call from an intensive care medic who operates ventilators. And we've taken a call from an engineer who fixes ventilators. And they are all, like the senior medic who led the development of the so-called Oxvent project, utterly baffled as to what the hell Dyson was doing anywhere near this project, this proposal, let alone securing special dispensations on taxation legislation from Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak. Do you want the Uber thing yet, or shall I take a couple more calls before I explain to you why this has echoes of Uber? For me, at least, I could have got it completely wrong. The more I egg the pudding, the more likely I am to embarrass myself subsequently. But we shall find out. 9 minutes after 11 is the time. Robin is in Stourport-on-Severn, where there is a rather nice fun fair, which I presume at the moment, Robin, is kiboshed by COVID.
Well, actually, hello. Hi, James.
Hello, mate. You weren't expecting that introduction, were you? I do apologise.
No,
I've taken you by surprise.
Not quite. No, as a fellow wire forester,
yes.
I'd like to say thank you for taking my call. It's been a long time listening, and it's good to speak to you.
Likewise.
Yeah, I speak from a company in Worcestershire who you may well know, and it doesn't matter really. Called G-Tech.
Yeah. Oh, gosh. Yes. Well, the G-Tech were part of this story, weren't they? At one point, G-Tech suggested that I think I saw the word hoax in the way the government was behaving. You said that it was so weird, you thought it might be a hoax.
Now, I speak as a customer services advisor studying for a law degree. Okay. So I'm not speaking on behalf of G-Tech.
Of course you're not.
There was a point last year when, early March, where the ventilator crisis happened, and it was just everyone could create a ventilator, and I think G-Tech did.
Yes.
Our owner did create a ventilator. It was Heath Robinson in its outlook, but it was done within 4 days, and then Worcestershire NHS Trust said, yes, actually, we'll take this on. This looks good, bring it in. And then instantly, Dyson had this text message with Boris they were told to stand down. Don't make any more. Don't carry on with this project.
Were they told why?
Because other manufacturers were going to be delivering. Now, if you look at the wider context, and it's something that's avoided the news, I think, that Dyson has not produced any ventilators, sorry.
That's right.
A bit nervous. Ventilators, post this offer. So actually, there was a point where you think that Boris may well have realised, hold on, I've just sent...
There's a fella in Worcester who's actually made one.
There's a guy who's made one and actually produced a blueprint online that anyone in the world can make for about 150 quid, I think it was.
I remember. It's not ideal, but if things were absolutely desperate, then this would have been a resort, wouldn't it?
And when you're moving heaven and earth, you look at the best possible option, don't you? And if the best possible option is texting your friend saying, yes, we'll give you a tax break if you bring your friends over from Singapore back to the UK to make something which we're not going to do, but it looks really good optically because it's a Dyson, wonderful-looking machine, and I can stand next to it with a flag and Priti Patel potentially, and say, this is British-made. We've beaten this.
If we can get something homegrown and don't forget, these are the people that wanted to put a Union flag on the AstraZeneca vaccine, which is, I think, as Swedish as it is British.
Absolutely.
Then I mean, people were dying at that point, not in their droves in this country, but we were seeing the terrible scenes from Italy. And Johnson, in the absence of another explanation, Johnson was thinking, wouldn't it be great if we could get a prominent Brexiter to come out of this with a win, even though I'm yet to speak to anybody qualified in the field who thought he had a cat in hell's chance of pulling it off.
Of course, absolutely. Why would you ask a vacuum cleaner manufacturer in Worcester to make a ventilator?
Yes, exactly.
When there are ventilator experts in the field who are saying, let's make our ventilator under license. But actually, no, hang on, James Dyson, he's a bit low on rent this week. Let's pop him over and see what he can do.
It's an odd
didn't
one.
buy any in at all.
Nothing turned up in the end at all. And thankfully, the emergency never occurred. So even your boss's, as you describe it, Heath Robinson invention, which could have been almost like a sort of wartime analogy there, wasn't needed. But the fact that he was told to stand down and stop actually working on them is it's a little bit strange, isn't it, Robin?
Let's think about it.
Go on.
A year ago, we were looking at field tents in New York City.
That's right.
And we were thinking, actually, this could be the way forward. So anyone who can make anything that can provide oxygen at the right level. You'd
at least have kept them. A few people are suggesting this is a scoop. This was reported at the time, as Robin would attest, and there is my daily reminder that the media that supported Brexit does not want you to know the truth about anything, not just the truth about Brexit. Robin, thank you. Leslie is in Gloucester. Leslie, what would you like to say?
So my kind of point is that there's a lot wrong with everything that's gone on, so please do not think that I'm sticking up for Boris, who is literally one of the worst people I can probably think of.
How dare you?
Or Mr. Dyson. But the company itself, so I've got someone in my family who works there. The company itself isn't necessarily focused on vacuum cleaners. It's focused more on air filtration and purification and the movement of air. And I think that's why they came out thinking that they were likely or possibly able to help in this whole thing, because at the time there was quite a lot of stress on the fact that we were going to have
I have to put a caveat here that even if you're right, it is on the proviso that he could secure these special tax arrangements directly from the Prime Minister.
Yeah, and I think and the whole thing was, it seems that they've been trying to say that the tax things was actually for the people that they were going to bring over, the specialists that they were going to bring over to come and work at the company, as opposed to the larger company itself.
The BBC reported that Dyson himself is understood to have arrived in this country the day after Johnson promised to sort everything out for him. Do you know, and I don't want you to dob in any family members, do you know how many senior Dyson staff came over to work on this?
No.
Be good to find out, wouldn't it? Can you make some calls for us?
Yeah, but I do know it was all hands on deck.
Right.
Obviously it cost the company 20 million, which
Well, I've seen that figure. Again, I'd like to see where that came from. What was it spent on?
It was spent a lot on prototypes and the cost of staff.
So wages that were already being paid, in other words.
Wages that were already being paid, but essentially it was like everybody was being put towards working on those.
Did we ever see any prototypes, do you know?
Yes, there were prototypes. Whether they were any good or not, I've absolutely no idea.
And we turn to the man who led, the professor of anaesthetics, no less, who spearheaded the Oxvent project. He says, in his view, that the prototype that you refer to was never a goer, and in his view, Sir James and the Prime Minister both knew it wasn't going to actually happen. You would dispute that with, of course, all the caveats that we've already established. You think they honestly did think they had a cat in hell's chance of pulling something out of the bag?
They felt they did.
They felt they did.
Which is possibly different.
No, that was a brilliant call, actually. You've got a real way with words, because I understand exactly what you've conveyed, and you have provided a little bit of counterbalance to the queue of people, more qualified than either of us, of course, but nevertheless, a counterbalance to the queue of people telling us that they cannot get their head around what has happened or why this fellow was even involved. And, of course, you know, we're back to the Kate Bingham point, was that even if he had pulled it off, then all of this would arguably be forgivable, you see. I'd love to come to the country's rescue as long as you allow me to continue paying my taxes in Singapore instead of having to put them into the treasury that's funding the NHS. Oh, well, okay, yeah, well, I guess we're a bit desperate, so you can carry on paying your taxes in Singapore rather than putting them into the treasury that's actually funding the NHS during this time of national emergency. That's fine if you come up with it. So you gave Kate Bingham a blank checkbook to go out and buy up vaccines like they were going out of fashion, and it worked. If it hadn't worked, the dobbing out of a blank checkbook would be pretty bad behaviour, but it worked. So, I mean, that would work as a counterbalance as well. But my goodness me, isn't it incredible? Nothing to see here, though. It's absolutely fine, because doctors and nurses don't create wealth. I love the radio. But it is more nuanced than Twitter, I think it's fair to say. But even on the radio, you can't quite tell when my tongue is in my cheek or when I'm teasing. I knew Brexit was the answer to this question when I asked you at 10 o'clock what it could possibly be about JCB and Dyson that prompted Boris Johnson to offer the latter preferential tax treatment. It was extended to everybody and it was voted for in the House of Commons, but it came about as a direct result of James Dyson not wanting either himself or his senior employees or both to pay tax to the Treasury that funds the NHS. They wanted to carry on paying much lower tax rates in Singapore, which is, of course, the reason why he moved so much of his business to Singapore. So I say this out loud, and I still naively think, oh, you'll get it now. It doesn't matter how many people are telling you, oh, no, this is all absolutely fine. This is absolutely marvellous. You can't expect billionaire entrepreneurs to obey the same rules that the little people have to pay. Why the hell should he be paying his taxes into the Treasury that actually funds the NHS? He's a patriotic hero. He supported Brexit. But it still stinks, even if it's crystal clear. But a few of you sweetly, and that sounds a bit patronising, but I promise you it isn't, rather sweetly, I replied to one of my favourite contributors who answered the question and explained what had gone on. I had to say this was actually a rhetorical question for the likes of you. I'm dumb, but I'm not that dumb. They wanted something that they could drape in the Union flag and claim was proof of English or British exceptionalism. And they ended up with diddly squat. Absolutely nothing. In fact, I didn't know, and I haven't looked into the report that Alicia referred to earlier in the programme. They ended up with a bunch of ventilators that were overpriced and not fit for purpose, reportedly. I find that very easy to believe because the other story in the news today sees the National Audit Office, again an independent organisation, expressing misgivings about many of the ways in which business has been done. This so-called high priority lane that was set up, I kid you not, for companies which had contacts with MPs. And they were 10 times more likely to get contracts than people not in the high priority lane. The defence will be, it was an emergency, we had to do it. Brackets, it was a complete coincidence that all the companies we turned to in this emergency, through necessity, were mates of ours, or even donors to our party, close brackets. That's why I found PMQs yesterday frustrating, because I feel Starmer is a lawyer, and this shower needs street fighters. It's an improvement on where we've been for the last few years, but it's by no means a solution to the problem. And listen, that was me criticising Keir Starmer, right? Criticising Keir Starmer. You are allowed to criticise politicians, even if they're a lot closer to your worldview than others. You have to be able to criticise him. At this point, they who shall remain nameless turn around and go, it's all your fault that Boris Johnson is in charge, because you kept telling people how awful the last bloke was. And then when he turned out to be even more awful than even you thought, it's your fault for telling people he was awful. It's nothing to do with him. Can't criticise him. Mustn't criticise him. 11:24 is the time. Tony is in Horsham. Tony, what's going on?
Morning, James.
Hello.
Well, I haven't heard much in the debate about the...
It's barely been a debate, really. It's just been a succession of expert testimony, Tony.
Well, one of the things about the ventilator contracts and other government contracts is that they would have been subject to EC regulations, and now they're not. I used to be interested in big IT contracts and would speak to commissioners at the EC fairly regularly about government departments breaking the rules on procurement, buying things without advertising them, not advertising the award of the contract, awarding contracts too quickly, that sort of thing. And I thought at the time, it's just as well that the EC is scrutinising the British government, because otherwise they wouldn't be paying attention to the rules on spending tens of billions, sometimes hundreds of millions on contracts. And now that it's happened, and the government seems to be awarding contracts to its friends or contacts without any rules in place. I wonder whether that was a factor in the debate in the going for Brexit in the first place, because it leads me to think, well,
I don't think that's much of a mystery, is it? I mean, was Brexit linked to the idea that pro-Brexit politicians should be able to do more favours for their mates?
Exactly.
Exactly.
And that's a concern, because there are only rules in place in the British government now. They're guidelines. There's nothing to stop ministers or government departments awarding contracts to people that they want to join when they've left government. At least the EC was there as a barrier, setting.
Well, don't be ridiculous. We've got standards, and we've got an independent advisor on the ministerial code and all that. Oh no, hang on, we haven't.
They're not enforceable.
No, we haven't even got one. He resigned in protest after Boris Johnson swept the Priti Patel bullying report under the carpet, and he hasn't been replaced yet. And of course, I know you know this, but lest anyone be confused, last year we were still under these rules and regulations. So all of the vaccine stuff and all of the procurement stuff was done it was during the transition period when we were still subject to EU legislation. And the legislation you described is designed to make sure that the best person got the contract, that you couldn't give preferential treatment to a company that was based in Birmingham over a company based in Berlin, because it would actually cost taxpayers more to give it to the company based in Birmingham than it would in Berlin. And there are, I think, Tony, emergency exemptions which would be covered by coronavirus. So you could say, no, we've got to move quickly. This is an emergency. This is an act of God type territory for insurance companies. So the rules are temporarily suspended. But you're suggesting that now we're out, good and proper, or bad and proper if you prefer, there aren't any rules anymore.
No, because at least you had something called accelerated procedures, which was a way round the rules. But you still had to explain it.
Yes.
Now you don't. Now there are just guidelines, and they're not enforceable. So if you decide to give a contract to your next door neighbour, if you decide that.
Oh, I don't know. Your pub landlord, maybe.
Pub landlord, exactly.
Top of my head, just a figure of speech.
There's nothing to stop you. At least when there was, you could go to the EC, a company that felt that it had been unfairly excluded from the shortlist could at least complain to the EC, and they would look into it, and the government departments would know that there would be scrutiny from the EC if they awarded a contract to a minister's neighbour or pub landlord.
So we could call that a deterrent against dodgy behaviour.
Exactly.
And that deterrent has now gone.
Exactly. And it's quite frightening.
If, for example, this report from Transparency International, 2 points, one to support what you just said, ministers ignored legal advice to give a failing company a test contract, ignored legal advice, leaving taxpayers with an £87 million bill for tests that did not work. Pigeon pest controllers and yoghurt makers were granted huge contracts despite having little previous experience in PPE production. So that's point one. Point two is that the report says only a select group even knew about this VIP lane, with those politicians in the know confined to one side of the house. It is our conclusion that the system for handling PPE offers was preloaded with bias. If you were a company in a position to provide PPE, Deborah Meaden has tweeted this morning that she knew several who couldn't get arrested. Where would you go now to complain about this unfair treatment, Tony? Well, I mean, to who would you appeal for justice?
Well, I think that the above all this, the reason all this is happening is because of something that Peter Oborn's written a lot about, which is the secrecy of government, which goes back decades, if not hundreds of years, and is now perhaps government is more secretive than ever. Therefore, when ministers do what they want to do, they know that there's not going to be scrutiny for a long time. Sometimes the NAO might report a year or two later, but even then, ministers will say, well, the NAO report's out of date. So there's always an answer. And I think the scrutiny of government at this stage is probably less than it's ever been. Independent scrutiny, that is.
Then we all should give thanks that so many journalists and newspapers are holding them to account every day, speaking truth to power all the time, and absolutely picking over the fine detail of what they claim has happened in every area of public life. Tony, am I right or am I right?
Trying to, yes.
One at a time, because it's a murky old day, isn't it? £2 billion worth of PPE deals for firms with Tory links. This is a report, and I need to tell you something, actually. I've probably mentioned it before, but I should stress again that I am trying wherever possible to take these stories of cronyism and what many people see as corruption. I'm trying to get them from newspapers that are generally supportive of the government and indeed of the Brexit debacle. So this is the Daily Mail, for example, today. More than £2 billion of PPE and testing contracts were awarded by the government to companies with links to prominent Tories, a damning report has found. And this is the Daily Telegraph. Without that brave woman with a phone, this is going back to yesterday's coverage of the George Floyd murder, all we would have had was a police report, something we suggested on the programme yesterday, and their Washington correspondent Nick Allen today contends that indeed without that phone, then Mr. Floyd, who'd been accused of using a fake $20 bill to buy cigarettes, would have seen his murder go unpunished. The original police report, as I told you yesterday, moved from the suspect being put in handcuffs to officers noting that he appeared to be suffering medical distress without mentioning, even in passing, the 9.5 minutes that Chauvin spent kneeling on his neck. So I like, because I know sometimes if I say it's in The Guardian, then very stupid people go, oh, it can't be true then. And by very stupid, I mean gullible. You might not actually be stupid, but you have obviously buckled under the weight of the bombardment or the gaslighting or the grooming that is so commonplace in this country at the moment. So it's the Daily Mail reporting today that the report by the anti-corruption campaigners Transparency International has found some £2 billion. I'd add so far to this, actually, given that a lot of the stuff, as Jolly and Morm over at the Good Law Project has explained to us on a couple of occasions, a lot of the stuff still hasn't been published. No competition whatsoever. So not only are you put on a VIP fast line if you're mates with a senior enough politician, but you don't actually have to compete for the contracts either. And that is how we end up with pigeon pest controllers and yoghurt makers being granted huge contracts despite having little previous experience in PPE production. I suppose going back to our caller from Gloucester, you have to at least acknowledge that building air purifiers or hand dryers or hoovers is a lot closer to building ventilators than making yoghurt is to making PPE. I think I'm safe on that, scientifically speaking, aren't I? I hope. Andy's in Birmingham. Andy, what would you like to say?
Yeah, so I faced the slight delight of being frontline on an intensive care doctor anaesthetist, and was responsible for taking people who were sick and stabilising them on ventilators on the intensive care unit last year.
Gosh.
And in that moment, I have to say, all I wanted was effective equipment to help me do my job,
yes.
Whether it was a ventilator, whether it was PPE. And in that time of national emergency, if that piece of equipment was effective, then I didn't really care in that moment, in that time of national emergency.
No, of course not.
And listening to your discussion, of course, the cronyism, the jobs of the boys, having Boris Johnson's telephone number and texting him is, of course, inappropriate. However, it's not just an issue with Tories, this. I think this is an issue of government. If you have got people like Deborah Meaden, manufacturers, clothing manufacturers, saying we are able to offer service, and they're not able to have a process of contacting, disseminating their information upwards so that it can be free and transparent, then that's not, I'm sure, exactly the same would happen no matter who was in government. And so,
I mean, obviously, I'll let that stand, but it's entirely speculative. And I mean, I think of perhaps Peter Mandelson and his dodgy dealings with the Hindujas, but he lost his job twice. So we haven't had any flavour. We haven't had any government except the Tories for the last 11 years, Andy. So I don't know what you're drawing that on.
Well, I mean, there's no doubt. I mean, I'm just thinking from a sense of taking away a bit of pragmatism. I mean, if I had this moment where, you know, there's a complex supply line for lots of separate individual parts, and you need somebody to assemble all of those in a extremely sensitive way.
Of course.
And let me tell you, ventilators are, as a previous caller was saying, incredible pieces of mechanical engineering. If a manufacturer gets in touch and says, we are happy to provide that service, then you would be mad not to keep that person or that organisation online to support you in a time of national need.
Which leads me to the caller who was working for GTEC at the time, just down the road from you in Worcestershire, and who apparently had come up with something that worked and got told to stand down and keep quiet. So
that is folly, and of course,
well, Dyson was offered tax breaks to carry on producing what turned out to be nothing.
Well, it's interesting, the Dyson thing, and, you know, having the process where you're sending text messages as the official way of contacting government is, of course, wrong, and I think that's what should come out of this. What is the process of up and down dissemination of information and the transparency? But in that moment where Boris Johnson, who hasn't been leader for that long, is faced with that happening, then I think in that moment, could I criticise him for saying I'll keep Johnson, for keeping Dyson online? I wouldn't particularly criticise him.
No, but of course you have to criticise him if he was treating other companies with arguably better cases worse.
Yeah, I mean,
your whole argument is built upon desperate times call for desperate measures. So why the hell would you go after a digger manufacturer and a Hoover bloke when there's a fellow up the road and there's a woman in Cambridge who's got a warehouse full of ventilators and she can't get her calls returned by the Department of Health? And then I'd steer you towards today's report from Transparency International, which says that this VIP lane that you got put on if you had the right contacts with the right politicians from the Conservative Party not only allowed you access to contracts without competition, but also gave you a 10 times better chance of getting a contract than if you weren't in the VIP lane, exacerbated by the very simple fact that most companies didn't even know it existed. So your arguments in an open and honest universe, your arguments would be unassailable. But we live in the opposite of an open and honest universe, and I do take issue with your suggestion that everybody else would behave the same, because you'd need to provide me with evidence.
I'm not saying everyone behave the same. I think what I'm saying is, as a front line in that time of need,
you wouldn't care where it had come from.
Yeah, because I'm looking at the patient and the person in front of me, and what's important is that patient and that person. And if I had an effective piece of kit to use, then in that time, you know, there was a little sense of pragmatism that I would want to.
I think we agree. I think we agree. All of your arguments are powerful and salient, but they are, I mean, unpicked by the fact that companies better qualified to produce the goods were being left out in the cold.
And I quite agree with you. So I think what needs to come out of this is looking at the process, because the process that was in place last year that was then fed into was, of course, wrong. And nobody would say that that wasn't the case. So in the future, you would want a more effective process where people with ventilators, people who can offer PPE within the correct specifications would be able to do whatever emergency we're going to face in the future. Undoubtedly,
that is the thing, isn't it? And speaking of learning from mistakes, I'm reading about India this morning, and I don't know what you think as an intensive care doctor, but you can still fly into this country from India until 4 o'clock tomorrow morning, and they recorded, I think, just shy of 315,000 new cases in the last 24 hours.
I mean, and again, that debate about how closely we followed our borders. But given the fact that Boris was, and I'm no defender of him or cronyism with George Boys, and, my upset about people having a direct line to somebody is palpable. But given he was in that situation, that was the system, and he was having to be pragmatic in that situation. Can you criticise him for what he did?
Well, I can, yes, but I'm not as qualified as you are, which is when I turn your attention to Andrew Farmery, the Professor of Anaesthetics at Oxford University, who, because I've said throughout, I don't know how much of the show you've heard, if Dyson had come up with the goods, then it would be for his conscience to deal with the fact that he didn't want to pay taxes into the Treasury that pays your wages and all the other NHS staff's wages and all the NHS costs. That's between him and his conscience. If he'd come up with the goods, the tax break that he got after texting the Prime Minister cosily would be a small price to pay for the provision of ventilators, but there was no provision of ventilators, and Andrew Farmery says, in his view, both knew it wasn't going to actually happen.
And, Andrew Farmer is somebody who previously tutored me, and
there you go.
Part of the Oxford London group I have personal respect for. But the question I would ask, if you've got a working prototype for your ventilator, the question I'd ask is, who would manufacture it?
Right, yes, so somebody else's prototype could have been manufactured by Dyson, which is, forgive me, one of the points we've been making in the course of the programme, not come up with something new from scratch. But before you go, how are you? This must have been a crazy year for you. Are you okay?
Yeah, no, it's been a crazy year. My wife, who was in shielding group, who was on chemotherapy at the time, meant that I had to do my job, leave home for a few months because, intensive care coronavirus couldn't mix. And so it was an extreme experience. And, in that moment when you're having to make those decisions, I think over the last year, as much as principles are important, there had to be, for me, a good deal of pragmatism, which is what made me ring into your programme.
And I'm glad you did.
As much as I would hold your principles, and I have a lot of time for listening to them regularly, there was a moment where I think you have to look at the individuals, the decisions that people were making.
I get all of that. Moment, I do understand, and I'm glad you've rung in, but I'm not going to apologise for the question I'm going to close with. While your wife was receiving chemotherapy, which meant that you couldn't live at home, and you were working on an intensive care unit throughout the coronavirus crisis, were you paying your taxes at the normal UK rate?
I hope so. Otherwise, I've got a bill coming.
Well, you would, of course, unless you can get the Prime Minister's text number, mate, and ask for a special dispensation. That is, I hope you'll agree, an allowable point.
Yeah, no, I think it's fair. But equally, maybe if I had a gripe with that, there should be an appropriate process for me to feed up the information. And I think that's what needs to be learnt for the future.
Top man, and thank you for everything you did. And I hope is your wife on the road to recovery? Has the chemotherapy been...
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. Thank you. I had an all clear last Friday.
That was a perfect point to end a wonderful call. Andy, thank you so much. The last word on this astonishing cronyism story, not so much the fact that, I'm pretty outraged by the fact that James Dyson can lobby the Prime Minister personally for preferential tax treatment while you can't. But I do remember that caller when we were discussing the Duke of Edinburgh, and I was suggesting to him that the Duke of Edinburgh wasn't an intrinsically better or more important person than he was, talking to a naval veteran, a war hero, who somehow felt that the Duke of Edinburgh was a more valuable human being than he was. And you do it with the royal, you can do it with someone who's very, very rich. So while I don't think it's right, I understand you might think it's perfectly normal for him to be able to pay taxes at a more preferential rate than you do, despite the fact that he's worth 16 billion quid and you probably aren't. But there we are. The last word on that is probably going to be Safia, who is in Newcastle-under-Lyme, or Newcastle-under-Lyme. What would you like to say, Safia?
Well, I actually live not far from where the JCB is. Funny enough.
In Staffordshire, yes.
Yeah. And I think, this has been going on for so long that now it needs to be accountable, and we as the public should make it accountable because it's our taxpayers' money. And like you said, the thing...
I don't know, did JCB get anything in the end? Did they? I don't know that they did. I think they were just sort of waved around the place, weren't they? And, of course, Johnson drove that ludicrous truck through a kind of polystyrene wall, but claims that happened on JCB land. But I don't know, I mean, that they actually ended up doing anything in the way that Dyson
but
did.
The thing is, but the thing is that that's actually happening. It should, and you text a friend. You never text. Do you know what I mean? Business wise, either. Do you know what I mean? How much more is this going to keep going? Because we've seen how they spend their money and their personal money. Well, taxpayers' money when they're for expenses, and everything just is about them.
Looks that way. Well, I think it was the wife of Lord Bamford, wasn't it, who runs JCB, who her company is called Dalesford Organics, and the Daily Mail reported last year that they'd been sent 30 giant boxes of shopping and up to 100 prepared meals smuggled into Downing Street via the rear entrance. You're not here to tell me that you don't regularly get giant boxes of posh food smuggled in through your back door, Sophia. Surely we've all done this.
I did.
What? You're joking. I don't believe you.
Well, no, because unfortunately I had a stroke, so my ability of movement and things has been really,
Well, my mum has had a stroke, so I know exactly what you speak of, and you would both be more deserving recipients of delivered food than perhaps Boris Johnson and his current girlfriend.
Yeah, it's been going on for so long, but I think now's the time with everything that's gone on. We have to say enough is enough, because it's not acceptable.
It's not, though, is it? I could open up the phone lines now if I started doing an impression of open up the phone lines now, and I could form an orderly queue of people saying nothing to see here, doesn't matter at all, absolutely nothing wrong whatsoever, it's all absolutely fine. You know how it works.
Well, this is the thing that just, that
I do know
keeps on going on.
I know.
But obviously there's many of us who would question, and I never voted for him, and I'm glad I didn't vote for him, because I don't like his personality, I don't like the way he approaches things.
How dare you?
Well,
He's a lovely man. He's a lovely man.
Well,
just ask his former wives, party leaders, employers, partners, mistresses and colleagues. They all speak so highly of him. His former headmaster, his former bosses, they've all got nothing but praise for him. That time he had to resign as a shadow minister after lying about having a mistress. He's never done that again, has he? It's not like he ended up with another mistress.
Oh my gosh, I don't even know what women see him.
Well, you found the right radio programme, Sophia. That's all I can say to you. And you have actually reminded me of the final hook and tease that I hadn't shared with you on the course of the programme. It's coming up to, Sophia, thank you, it's coming up to 11:59. Mystery Hour is on the way. So this might not work. It's had 2 hours to percolate, and I think it works. So I wondered whether or not Johnson had broken the ministerial code on this. And I think at least in the spin, not that it matters, because there's no independent advisor on the ministerial code anymore. He resigned after Boris Johnson swept his report into Priti Patel's bullying of colleagues under the carpet. But if there had been, and this was referred to him, the point is that if a politician, if a member of government is in contact with business people, then there is supposed to be a civil servant present at all times. The top civil servant, Simon Case, is reported in the Times today to have urged Boris Johnson to change his phone number because of the amount of people contacting him personally, potentially seeking to influence policy decisions. He's also signed up to something called the Signal messaging service, which lets users erase messages automatically after a set period of time. So the accountability and the transparency that Sophia and many other callers today have called for is still a long way off. So, I mean, also, he's had this phone number for more than a decade, so goodness knows how many girlfriends have got it, and he probably, or possibly, or potentially, or allegedly might be worried about them not being able to get in touch with him whenever they want to. So the argument I've seen is that texts are exempt from the bit of the code that says you can't do these conversations without having a civil servant present. If it happened in person or even on email, then the ministerial code would say that you have to have a civil servant present. But texts are exempt, which to me is like that judge who said that if you hail a cab using your phone, you're not actually hailing a cab. So Uber is not in contravention of the terms and conditions that black cab drivers enjoy. So exclusively in the past, hailing a cab by putting your hand in the air was the preserve of the black cab trade, right? Uber came along. It's even called a ride-hailing service. And yet the court found, when the case was put before it, that you're not actually hailing a cab in a way that undermines the exclusivity of the black cab trade. So for me, it's the same. Boris Johnson's not breaching the ministerial code because he didn't have this conversation in person, he had it by text. Oh. Uber users are not hailing cabs because they didn't hail a cab by putting their hand in the air, they hailed a cab by pressing a button on their phone. And I think on reflection that worked quite well.